11 months, Richard Calloway said, and your black hands still can't carry a tray without making a mess of my floor. He didn't yell it. That was the worst part. He said it the way a man says good morning casual certain like the words cost him nothing because they never had. He crouched down, picked up a single dropped napkin and held it in front of her face. You see this? You see? This is what you are. Something I pick up off the ground. He dropped it again, deliberately. Eyes locked on hers. I've paid more for the shoes on my feet than your mother made in 10 years of cleaning up after people like me. And here you are, doing the same thing she did. Some things just don't change, do they? Then he grabbed her by the arm. Full fist. No warning. He dragged her 18 feet of white Italian marble toward the front door, while 6 people in that foyer turned to stone. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Nobody. He threw her toward the entrance. She caught herself on the doorframe, turned around. 2 words. Quiet as a verdict. Jasmine Webb. His hand dropped. His face went white. Who are you? That's the right question. 8 months too late. Stay with this, you won't want to miss what comes next. Drop your city and local time in the comments. And if you believe no one should ever be spoken to that way, subscribe. This story is about to change everything. 8 months before Richard Calloway dragged her across his marble floor, a woman named Cece Graves walked through the staff entrance of the Calloway estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, carrying a worn canvas bag and a resume that was entirely professionally and deliberately false. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, orthopedic shoes, the left heel worn down at a slight angle, a gray cardigan with a button loose at the third eyelet. Her nails were cut short and unpolished. No earrings, no bracelet, no rings, no perfume. Nothing that lingered, nothing that caught the light, nothing that asked to be remembered. That was the point. Everything about Cece Graves had been designed to disappear. But Cece Graves was not Cece Graves. Her real name was Celeste Morgan. She was 44 years old, and she had spent 2 decades making powerful people profoundly uncomfortable. She had broken the story that cost a Chicago hospital administrator his career, his credentials, and eventually his freedom after a 3-year federal investigation. She had spent 4 months embedded in a county housing authority to expose a city councilman who had redirected $2.3 million in affordable housing funds into shell companies registered under his wife's maiden name. She had testified before a state legislative committee, received 2 death threats, and 1 lawsuit that collapsed within 90 days, and worked through all of it without missing a single deadline. She was freelance now, which meant she answered to no editor, no publisher, no board of directors with shareholders to protect. She answered only to the story. And she had never once in 20 years walked away from one that mattered. This particular story had started with a voicemail. 6 months before she applied for the position at the Calloway estate, a 19-year-old black girl named Jasmine Webb had been found dead in her apartment in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The official ruling was accidental. The investigation lasted exactly 4 days. The case was closed on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning, it had vanished from every local news cycle without leaving a trace. No follow-up coverage, no community response, no name mentioned in print beyond a 2-sentence item in a police blotter. Jasmine had spent 7 months working as a household maid at the Calloway estate. She had been fired 4 months before her death, accused of stealing a pearl necklace valued at $3,200. She had signed a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a check for $8,000, every dollar of which she had used to keep her apartment and utilities running while she searched for her next position. Within 60 days of signing that agreement, she had been quietly flagged to every domestic staffing agency in the state of Connecticut. Not one returned her calls. Not one reviewed her resume. She went from a 90-day performance evaluation that called her exceptional and reliable to completely unemployable in the span of 8 weeks. And nobody in any official capacity found that sequence of events unusual enough to examine. Naomi Webb, Jasmine's mother, found Celeste through a victims' advocacy nonprofit in New Haven. She arrived at their meeting carrying one thing: her phone. She pressed play without introduction, and the room went still. Jasmine's voice on the recording lasted 22 seconds. She sounded exhausted and frightened, and achingly young. "Mom, I can't get a job anywhere. Nobody will even call me back. I don't know what he told them, but whatever it is, they all believe it. I don't know what to do anymore. I'm scared." Celeste sat in the parking lot afterward for 40 minutes. She listened to that voicemail 11 times before she started the car. She agreed to take the case the following morning. The preparation took 3 weeks. A complete cover identity was constructed with the precision of someone who understood that a single loose thread could end everything. Employment references that answered immediately. A social media presence. A Facebook page for a quiet woman named Cece Graves, who posted photos of her grandniece's birthday parties and occasionally shared recipes she had never cooked. A full background check would return nothing of interest, because nothing of interest was intended to be found. The equipment was embedded where no one would look. The reading glasses held a micro-lens camera in the left frame, transmitting continuous footage to an encrypted server. The third button of her uniform jacket contained a secondary camera angled slightly upward. Both devices fed live to Marcus Tate, her editor-handler, and the only person in the world who knew exactly what she was doing in a rented office suite in Stamford, 22 miles from the estate. Marcus had 2 monitors, 4 terabytes of storage, and strict instructions to contact her burner phone only in genuine emergencies. There was one thing Celeste had not told Marcus. Not the attorney who reviewed her entry plan. Not Naomi Webb. Not anyone. Her mother's name was Dorothy Morgan. Dorothy Morgan had cleaned other people's houses in Baltimore, Maryland for 35 years. She had cleaned them with care and precision and total invisibility. Not once in 3.5 decades had a single employer learned her birthday, asked about her health, or treated her as a person whose life extended beyond their front door. She came home on winter evenings smelling like someone else's kitchen, ate dinner standing at the counter because she was too tired to sit, and told her daughter the same thing every night in the same quiet voice. "You are going to be someone they have to pay attention to." Celeste had become that person. She was paying attention now. She pressed the buzzer at the staff entrance, gave the name Cece Graves, heard a flat voice respond, and a door click open, and stepped through without looking back. She had studied Richard Calloway for 3 weeks. She knew his routines. She knew his patterns. She knew the version of himself he sold to the world, the philanthropy speeches, the foundation galas, the magazine covers, where he talked about lifting marginalized communities while his household staff ate cold food in a back corridor with no windows. She knew the surface. What she did not know was that Jasmine Webb was not the first person this man had methodically destroyed. Not the third. Not even the 6th. She was simply the youngest, and the only one who had not survived. The Calloway estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, sat at the end of a private road lined with old-growth oaks that had been rooted in that soil longer than the county's zoning laws had existed. 18,000 square feet of white colonial architecture. Lawns maintained to an unnatural shade of green by a grounds crew that arrived before sunrise and cleared out before 4 p.m. A 6-car garage, a security system contracted to a private firm at an annual cost that exceeded the median household income of the neighboring city of Bridgeport, the same city where Jasmine Webb had lived and died in an apartment without central heating. From the road, it looked like the American dream fully realized. From the staff corridor on the morning Celeste walked through it, It felt like a place specifically designed to make certain people feel the dimensions of the space between themselves and the man who owned it. She met the rest of the staff before she ever saw Richard Calloway. Marta Reyes had worked that kitchen for 11 years. She was 63, compact and strong-handed, and she moved through the kitchen with a quietness that went beyond efficiency. The particular quiet of a woman who had spent years calculating the exact amount of space she was permitted to occupy at any given moment. She greeted Celeste with a brief nod, a cup of black coffee, and an orientation that was exactly 3 sentences. Breakfast at 7:15, not 7:10, not 7:20. If something breaks, you report it before he finds it. When he speaks to you, answer and stop. She offered no explanation for the 3rd rule. The way she said it made explanation unnecessary. Devin Briggs was 26 with careful eyes and a smile that traveled to about the halfway point of his face and stopped as though it had learned not to go further. He had worked the grounds for 2 years. He walked Celeste through the cleaning supply rooms and the weekly rotation schedule without wasting a word, noted which hallways Richard preferred in the mornings, and which rooms had been recently refurnished, and spoke throughout in the clipped, functional shorthand of a man who had stripped communication down to its most essential components. 2 housekeepers, both named Maria, distinguished by their last initials, communicated primarily through glances that carried entire conversations. A driver named Frank ate lunch alone in the garage, with the door half closed, and had refined the practice of invisibility to an art form. 7 people total running an 18,000 square foot estate. Not one of them smiled past the surface of the expression. Conversations ended before they could grow roots. The house held a quality Celeste would describe in her field notes that evening as pressurized, not the silence of a peaceful environment, but the held-breath tension of people who had learned that drawing attention carried consequences. She understood what they were holding their breath against on the 2nd morning of her employment. Richard Calloway came downstairs at 7:08. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, with posture that didn't come from exercise, but from a lifetime of assuming that every room he entered had been waiting for him. Pressed white shirt, no tie, cufflinks that picked up the kitchen light. He crossed the room without acknowledging anyone opened the refrigerator, stood examining its contents for several seconds, with the expression of a man reviewing an underwhelming quarterly report, and then he turned and looked at Marta. He didn't speak. He just looked. 1 second. 2. 3, 4, 5. Do this again, and you're done. He closed the refrigerator and left the room. Nobody moved for a count of 3. Then Marta quietly adjusted a temperature on the back burner, and the moment dissolved as though it had never occurred. No one asked what he had meant. In this house, precision in a threat was a courtesy Richard Calloway did not extend to his staff. The ambiguity was the mechanism an undefined consequence is a more effective instrument of control than a defined one because it can be applied to anything at any moment for any reason. Everyone in that kitchen had been living inside that system long enough that it no longer required explanation. Celeste documented everything. That evening, door locked, light off. She transmitted the day's footage to Marcus on the burner device's encrypted connection. Her field note was brief. Day 4, pattern visible from first interaction. Fear is not incidental to this environment. It is the environment, not performed structural. Marcus replied, In 20 minutes, I see it. Stay steady. She catalogued further details across the following days. The study door glimpsed open during a cleaning rotation, the philanthropy wall inside framed magazine covers, photographs with elected officials, a Calloway Foundation banner, reading Investing in Communities of Color, positioned above a photo of Richard in mid-laugh with a black university president. The wall appeared not to notice its own irony. On day 3, folding linens alongside Devon, She asked casually whether the staff had been given the Wi-Fi password. He kept his eyes on the sheets. There was a man let go last year for sending an email from inside the house. For an email. He moved to the next pile. He had already said everything that needed saying. That evening, one line in her field notes: deliberate isolation from outside communication during working hours, not employer caution, designed control. On Friday of her second week, Richard, in New York, the study empty. Celeste assigned to cleaning rotation, she followed standard procedure through the room. Bookshelves, desk surface, side table, then the desk drawers, which a thorough cleaning required. First drawer pens, a leather notebook, paper clips. Second drawer correspondence folders organized by month. Third drawer, a checkbook and a receipt folder. Fourth drawer empty, or so it appeared. She pressed the base of the drawer with 2 fingers. It yielded slightly. She pressed the corner. The bottom panel lifted free, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside, a single manila folder with a typed label on the tab. 4 words. Staffing resolutions. Confidential. 2019 to present. Her hand did not shake. Her breathing did not change. Her expression showed nothing. Only her eyes shifted that particular quality of absolute stillness Celeste Morgan's face had learned to carry over 20 years of finding exactly what she had come to find. The folder held 11 documents. Each one was a termination record. Each had a name at the top, employment dates, and an end date. Each included a typed paragraph headed, "Conduct resulting in separation." Brief clinical written in the flat, institutional language of someone who had drafted this kind of document many times before. And clipped to each termination record, fastened with a single paperclip, was a 2-page non-disclosure agreement stamped "Executed" in red ink, and a handwritten dollar amount circled in the lower right corner. 11 records. Every alleged infraction described with the same measured precision. Every payment amount different. Every name when Celeste read down the list belonging to a person of color. She photographed each page through the micro lens in her glasses, moving methodically, pausing on each document long enough for the image to resolve cleanly. The study light was adequate. Her hands were steady. She had photographed evidence in courthouse filing rooms, in the back seats of moving cars, in a supply closet with a pen light. A private study in Greenwich was not the most difficult environment she had worked in. She documented in sequence. First the index page, a plain typed list of names and dates, then each termination record, then each attached NDA, then the payment summary at the back. The total across 11 people across 5 years was $147,000. She paused on that number longer than on anything else. Not because it surprised her, because it didn't. $147,000 spread across 11 human lives purchased in installments, each payment calibrated to what a person in financial stress would accept in exchange for permanent silence. $147,000 to ensure that 11 people, all without savings, most without legal representation, none with a network that could compete against a man worth $340 million, would say nothing, do nothing, and disappear. To Richard Calloway, it was not a significant sum. It was a maintenance expense, a line item in the operational budget of his personal empire, somewhere between landscaping and quarterly property taxes. She reached the 9th record. Webb Jasmine. R. Start date, March 14th. End date, October 22nd. Conduct resulting in separation. Theft of personal property valued at $3,200. 1 cultured pearl necklace, 18-inch strand. Item confirmed missing following staff access to primary bedroom. Settlement amount $8,000. NDA executed and notarized October 25th. She read it twice. She photographed it 3 times from different angles to ensure the image was clean. She already knew the facts. Naomi Webb had given her the outline, but seeing it typed on paper, filed, indexed, stored in a labeled folder behind a false drawer, Bottom made it something different from what it had been. This was not a man who had reacted badly in a moment of anger. This was a man who had processed a 19-year-old girl through a system. There was a procedure. There was a protocol. Jasmine Webb had not been an incident. She had been a transaction. One of 11. Near the back of the folder, tucked behind the last NDA, she found something that had not been typed by a secretary or formatted by an attorney. A half-sheet of Callaway Enterprises letterhead folded once. Handwriting cramped, angular, unmistakably personal. Per our conversation, J.W. flagged to all agency partners. Do not refer, no exceptions. Dated 2 weeks after the NDA was signed. Celeste read it once. Then she read it again. He had not fired Jasmine Webb and moved forward. After the paperwork was complete and the check was deposited and the silence was legally secured, he had personally reached out to ensure she could not rebuild. The blacklisting was not a side effect of the termination process. It was a deliberate second act, executed after the NDA was already in place, a private decision to extend the punishment beyond the property line into every agency and every hiring contact in the state. He had wanted to be certain. He had wanted her not merely gone from his house, but removed from the industry entirely. Celeste replaced the folder precisely as she had found it. False bottom lowered back into position. Drawer closed. Desk surface undisturbed. She moved to the hallway, turned toward the laundry room, and started a load of whites with the composed efficiency of a woman who had not just photographed the foundation of a career-ending civil case. 38 minutes later in her room, she transmitted all 11 images to Marcus. His response came back in under an hour. I have everything. Running backgrounds on all 11 now. Starting with the 4 most recent. Give me 6 hours. Take 4. At 11:40 that night, her burner phone vibrated. 4 of the 11 filed formal complaints with the Connecticut Department of Labor. All 4 withdrawn within 30 days of filing. Celeste stared at the screen for a long moment. Withdrawn or bought off. The reply took less than 30 seconds. From what I can see, same thing. She lay in her narrow staff bed, with the folder's contents replaying in the dark, 11 names, 11 transactions, 1 handwritten note about a girl who should still have been alive. She was not thinking about the story. She was past the story. She was thinking about the layer beneath the folder, the thing she had not yet found. Then someone knocked on her door. Soft. 2 knocks. Deliberate. She opened it. Devon stood in the dim hallway, still dressed, checking both directions before he spoke. You went in his study today. Not a question. Cleaning rotation, Celeste said. Devon studied her face for a moment that ran several seconds longer than a casual look. Not suspicion. Something closer to its opposite. The expression of a person who has been waiting a long time for something without knowing they were waiting. You're different from the others, he said quietly. He walked away before she could answer. Celeste stood at the open door and listened to his footsteps fade down the hall. Then she closed the door, sat back down on the edge of her bed, and considered what Devon Briggs had just decided about her and what he might do with it next. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what she was building. He just knew that she was the first person in 2 years who had walked into that house and looked at the staff as though they were human beings. And sometimes Celeste knew that was enough. Month 3 brought a new protocol to the Callaway estate delivered by Paul Vance on a Monday morning with the casual authority of someone announcing a minor administrative update. Monthly performance reviews. All staff. Individual sessions. Conducted in the formal dining room. Paul Vance was 51 years old, lean, meticulously dressed, with the professional composure of a man whose entire value to his employer resided in his ability to deliver uncomfortable things in comfortable language. He had worked alongside Richard Callaway for 9 years. He understood the purpose of these reviews before the word was ever spoken in his presence, and so did every person in that house from Marta in the kitchen to the two Marias who communicated primarily through glances. The formal dining room seated 14. A chandelier hung above the center of the table that had cost more than Devon Briggs would earn in 3 years at the estate. Paul Vance sat at one end with a yellow legal pad and a pen. The chair across from him was a single chair positioned so that whoever occupied it would feel, for reasons that had nothing to do with the room's dimensions, the full weight of that distance. The questions followed a consistent pattern. Had you had any contact with former employees of the estate since your hire date? Had you been approached by anyone outside the household? A journalist, a researcher, a representative of any outside organization? Did you have any concerns about your current employment that you wished to raise at this time? The third question was the architecture of the entire exercise. It was not an invitation. It was a diagnostic. A person who raised a concern was a person who might raise that concern somewhere else, to a staffing agency, a labor board, a reporter with a deadline. A person who said they had no concerns had correctly identified what the review was actually measuring. Everyone came out of that room having said they had no concerns. Celeste went in on a Thursday afternoon. She sat across from Paul Vance. Hands folded in her lap, expression composed, and answered each question in the quiet, unhurried voice of Cece Graves, a woman with nothing to hide and no appetite for complications. She had had no contact with former employees. No one had approached her. She had absolutely no concerns. Paul Vance wrote something on his legal pad. She couldn't see what. What Celeste could not observe from where she sat was the far edge of the room behind her right shoulder. Richard Callaway had positioned himself there slightly behind the doorframe's line, where he could watch each review without being its official presence. He had done this for every session. He watched the way hands moved the pace of answers, the precise quality of stillness in a person's face when they believed they were not being closely examined. After Celeste left, he stood at the window without speaking. "She's too calm," he said. Paul Vance looked up from the legal pad. "Sir, they're all calm. They need the employment." Not like that. Richard didn't turn from the glass. "When I walk into a room, people adjust. Their shoulders, their pace, something in their eyes shifts. She doesn't adjust. Not once in 3 months. That could mean nothing." "It could," Richard said quietly. He said it the way a man says something he fully intends to return to. Celeste's field note that evening was precise. Month 3. Reviews are soft interrogation structured around one central question designed to identify who represents a risk. Richard observed from the room's blind corner during my session. He is building a behavioral map. He suspects something specific about me. I am giving him nothing that confirms it. The performance must hold. Month 4 arrived, cold and gray, and with it came Devon's last day. There was no prior conversation, no formal warning. Paul Vance found Devon on the south lawn at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, handed him a sealed envelope containing 2 weeks of pay, and informed him that his position was being eliminated effective immediately. He was to collect his personal belongings and vacate the property by noon. Devon did not ask why. Asking why was not a thing people did at the Callaway estate, because the stated reason was never the real reason, and the act of asking could itself be logged as a form of resistance. He went to his room, packed a single duffel bag with the efficient economy of a man who had been mentally prepared to leave for longer than he had admitted to himself, and walked toward the parking area. He passed the laundry room on his way out. Celeste was folding a stack of pressed tablecloths. She heard the duffel strap hit the doorframe before she saw him. He stood at the entrance with his jacket on and his bag over one shoulder, and he looked at her the way people look when they have something to say and have run out of time to find the right shape for it. He reached into his jacket's front pocket and held out a folded square of paper without speaking. She took it. "For when you need it," he said. He was gone before she could respond. She heard his truck start in the side lot, heard the tires roll down the private drive, heard the engine turn onto the main road and fade. She waited until she reached the supply closet. She unfolded the paper slowly. A name she already knew. A phone number she did not yet have. And below both, in Devon's handwriting, 10 words that carried the weight of 2 years of silence finally reaching its end. She's been waiting for someone to listen. Celeste folded the note and slid it inside the lining of her left shoe. She stood in the closet for a long moment without moving. Devon Briggs did not know her real name. He did not know what she was building or why she had come, or that every exchange between them had been logged and transmitted. All he knew was what 2 years in that house had trained him to recognize that someone was paying the kind of attention that was different from everyone else's. He had used his last hour on that property to make sure it didn't go to waste. In a house built entirely on the certainty that no one would ever look closely enough, that single act was the bravest thing Celeste had witnessed in 3 months. And she had been watching everything. Month 5 brought the Callaway Foundation annual dinner. 300 guests. A rented ballroom at a Manhattan hotel whose lobby alone cost more per evening to operate than Marta Reyes earned in a calendar year. White tablecloths laid with geometric precision floral arrangements, built to a height that required their own delivery crew, a string quartet positioned near the entrance, playing something classical and expensive, and above the main stage, suspended between 2 spotlights, a banner 14 feet wide, bearing the foundation's name and its motto, in gold serif letters, "Advancing Opportunity, Lifting Communities." Celeste and 2 other estate staff were bussed in from Greenwich to assist with setup and service. She spent the hour before guest arrival arranging glassware under a banquet supervisor who treated a misaligned fork as a character defect. Then the ballroom doors opened, the guests arrived, and Celeste became what she had practiced for 5 months. A gray uniform moving through a sea of designer gowns and $12,000 watches carrying a champagne tray thoroughly and completely invisible. She had been invisible in professional contexts before. Stakeouts in hotel lobbies, observation work in corporate conference settings. But those invisibilities had been chosen. This one wore a uniform. Richard Callaway took the stage at 8:45. He spoke for 14 minutes on economic mobility, the racial wealth gap, and what he called the moral obligation of the privileged to dismantle the structural barriers that had excluded entire communities from the prosperity they had helped build. His delivery was measured and warm. He cited statistics with easy precision. Toward the end, he announced a $2 million endowment to a historically black university in Virginia. The room rose. The ovation lasted 40 seconds. He smiled through it with the comfortable grace of a man who had been applauded in rooms like this for 2 decades. Celeste stood near the service corridor with her tray level and her face still. 4 days ago, this same man had informed Marta Reyes, after 11 years of service, that her kitchen duties were being permanently reassigned. He had given no reason. He hadn't needed one. The reason had never been the point. She filed it away and kept moving. During a service break, she passed through the East Corridor bathroom near the rear of the ballroom. Two men in evening wear stood at the sinks talking into the mirror, not noticing the woman in gray who had come in to straighten her collar. "He's going to make the announcement next month," one said. "Senate seat. His people have been in conversation with the state party for weeks. Does he think the timing is right given with his money?" The first man smiled. "The timing is always right." They left without finishing the sentence. The door swung shut behind them. Celeste stood at the sink without moving for 3 seconds. Then she walked directly to the service pantry, positioned herself behind a rack of spare stemware, and spoke quietly. "Marcus, he's announcing a Senate run next month. If he gets that insulation, we lose years. I need the full evidentiary package ready by the end of month 7. No more extensions." 60 miles away in Stamford, Marcus was already typing, "Understood. Full NDA financial trace by Friday." She walked back out into the ballroom with a fresh tray and spent the remaining 2 hours of the evening being invisible with a new and specific urgency. The weeks following the gala brought a tightening. A business partnership dissolved in late month 5. A quarterly financial report came in below projection. Richard began spending longer hours in his study with the door closed, and the quality of that closed door was different now. Not the focused quiet of a man at work, but the compressed silence of pressure building behind a sealed surface. When the door opened, it opened fast. The staff absorbed it the way they always absorbed these periods, by reducing themselves further, by anticipating, by moving through the house with the particular efficiency of people trying to give a volatile environment as few points of friction as possible. It did not help Marta. 6 weeks after the gala on a Tuesday morning, Richard called her into the study and told her that her kitchen assignment was being restructured. Effective that afternoon, she would work the laundry rotation full-time. A contracted service would manage the kitchen going forward. 11 years. She had run that kitchen for 11 years through 3 renovations, 2 housekeeping staff turnovers, 1 complete refresh of the dining room. She walked out of the study with her shoulders level and her face composed, because that was what 11 years in that house had built into her body as a default. And she maintained it all the way to the supply closet at the far end of the service corridor. Celeste found her there 6 minutes later. She didn't say anything useful. There were no useful things to say. She sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the lower shelf, and Marta, after a moment, sat down beside her. 2 women in gray uniforms on a cold floor beneath a buzzing fluorescent light, and the only sound for a long time was the distant hum of the washing machines in the adjacent room. They sat there for 11 minutes. Then Marta stood, straightened her uniform, and went to find her new rotation schedule. Celeste stayed on the floor for another moment. Then she stood too. She transmitted a field note that evening that contained 1 sentence she read back 3 times before sending, "He doesn't punish because something goes wrong. He punishes to demonstrate that things going wrong is entirely up to him." 3 weeks later, Richard appeared in the doorway of Celeste's staff room on a Sunday evening unannounced. He stood there scanning every surface, the nightstand, the small desk, the folded uniform on the chair, with the focused precision of a man searching for something he couldn't yet name. "I know when things have been touched," he said without inflection. "In my study, things get touched. I follow the assigned cleaning rotation, sir. Nothing more." He held her gaze for 5 full seconds, then left without another word. That night, "Marcus, he suspects something. Not specific, yet instinct. Give me 4 more weeks. I'll have everything we need." 4 weeks. She just needed 4 more weeks. What she did not yet understand was that Richard Calloway had already decided he was done waiting. Month 7 opened on a Sunday morning with a scratch on a side table in the formal sitting room. It was barely visible, a faint line no longer than 2 inches running across the lacquered surface of a mahogany side table that had been in the room since before Celeste arrived. The kind of mark that accumulates on furniture that is used. The kind of thing that in a normal household is noticed and forgotten within the same breath. Richard Calloway discovered it at 9:40 a.m. while walking the ground floor with his coffee. He set the mug down on the opposite table. He crouched and examined the scratch for 30 full seconds, running his thumbnail along its length twice. Then he stood and called the staff. All of them. Immediately, the sitting room. What followed lasted 40 minutes. Celeste would later describe it in her field notes as a demonstration rather than a reprimand, not an expression of anger, but a carefully staged exhibition of control. Richard did not raise his voice. He moved slowly along the edge of the room, hands clasped behind his back, and spoke to each staff member in turn about responsibility, about the standard of care his property required, about what it communicated when a person damaged something that had been entrusted to them. Everything in this house, he said, pausing at the center of the room, is an extension of the man who built it. When you damage what is mine, you are telling me something about how you regard me. I want you to think very carefully about what I do with that information. Nobody moved. The two Marias had their eyes on the floor. Frank, the driver, stood with his hands clasped in front of him. Marta, who had survived 11 years in this house by learning which moments required stillness above all else, kept her gaze level and her expression composed. Richard stopped in front of Celeste. He reached out and wrapped his hand around her upper arm. Not with force. With certainty, the particular grip of a man who has never had to force anything because he has always assumed the outcome. Laundry, until I say otherwise. He released her and turned away without waiting for acknowledgement. The gathering was over. In the laundry room alone, Celeste checked both cameras. Running. She checked the burner device and found 3 messages from Marcus waiting. She typed, "I need 2 things by Friday. The full documentation on all 4 labor complaints, specifically how they were withdrawn, and Jasmine Webb's complete employment file from the temp agency. Everything they have." Marcus delivered on Thursday evening. The 4 labor complaints filed against the estate across a 3-year period had been withdrawn as expected within 30 days of each filing. What Marcus had now confirmed was how. Paul Vance had contacted the new employers of 3 of the 4 complainants within 2 weeks of each complaint being registered, not with legal documents, not with formal correspondence, but with phone calls. Brief, professionally worded, delivering what he described in 2 documented instances as concerns about prior work performance and a pattern of difficulty with supervision. In every case, the new employer had acted within a week. Hours reduced. Duties reassigned. In 2 cases, employment ended within the month. It was not bribery. It was not technically prosecutable the way an NDA clause was prosecutable. It was something quieter and more durable. Sustained pressure applied through a network built over 20 years of strategic generosity. A man who had donated to the right foundations, attended the right dinners, and called in the right favors at the right moments. The system was not written down anywhere. It didn't need to be. It had worked every single time. Jasmine. Webb's employment file arrived Friday at 9 p.m. 90-day review, exceptional work ethic, highly reliable, recommended for permanent placement. Filed March 14th. 7 months of documented clean service. Then a single-line termination note client request, conduct unspecified. An NDA executed 5 days later. A check for $8,000 deposited October 29th. And then a handwritten note in the agency's internal log added 6 weeks after the NDA that read, "Do not re-refer to Calloway household or affiliated clients." Celeste called Naomi Webb on the burner phone at 8 p.m. Naomi answered on the first ring the way she always did, as though the phone had never fully stopped being a thing she was waiting to hear from. "Naomi, I have Jasmine's full file. I have the payment trail and the NDA documentation. I need to ask you one more question. Ask me. Did Jasmine ever mention anyone else who had worked at the estate before her? Someone who left under circumstances that troubled her, or someone who seemed to have disappeared from the staffing records without explanation? Naomi was quiet. Not the quiet of someone without an answer. The quiet of someone deciding how far to go. There was a woman, she said finally. Jasmine brought her up maybe twice. Said she'd worked there for several months before Jasmine started. Said she had seemed frightened toward the end, like something had happened that Jasmine never got the full story on. And then she was simply gone. Agency acted like she'd never been on their books. A name, Jasmine only knew her first name. Gloria, said Celeste wrote the name in her notebook. Gloria, one word on a blank page. She just disappeared. That's how Jasmine described it. 1 week she was there. The next week nobody mentioned her. Nobody explained anything. And when Jasmine asked another staff member, they looked at her like she'd said something dangerous. Celeste thanked Naomi and ended the call. She sat on the edge of her staff bed for a long time, with the notebook open on her knee, looking at the single name. A woman named Gloria, who had worked inside this house, experienced something inside this house, and then, according to every available record, had simply ceased to exist as a professional entity. No forwarding address, no filed complaint, no NDA that Marcus could locate, which meant either she had signed one under a name she no longer used, or she had been removed from the situation through a mechanism that left no paper trail at all. Both possibilities were worth finding out. Celeste needed to find Gloria, and she needed to do it before Richard Calloway understood how little time he had left. Marcus found her in 4 days. Gloria Sims, 52 years old, currently residing in Providence, Rhode Island, living with her younger sister in a 2-story house near the edge of the Elmwood neighborhood. No social media presence, no listed phone number, no employment record in the domestic services sector after a specific date, 26 months prior, a date that, when Celeste cross-referenced it against the Calloway Estate's staffing timeline, fell 11 months before Jasmine Webb's first day. Gloria had been there first. She had left. And then she had rebuilt a life that was deliberately difficult to locate. Celeste drove to Providence on her day off a Sunday with a thermos of coffee and an address sourced from a public utilities record. She parked on the street, walked to the front door, and knocked twice. Nothing for 20 seconds. Then the quiet, careful sound of movement behind the frosted glass panel beside the door. The door opened 3 inches, held in place by a chain. A woman looked at her through the gap, with the measured caution of someone who had developed through experience a well-calibrated distrust of unexpected visitors. "I don't talk about that," Gloria said. She hadn't asked what Celeste was there for. "I know," Celeste said. "I'm not here to pressure you into anything. I just want you to know that someone is listening. If you're ready, you don't have to be ready today." The gap held for a long moment. Then the chain slid free. They sat at Gloria's kitchen table with cups of tea that went cold while Gloria talked for 2 hours. What she described was not a single incident, but a sustained architecture, the kind of environment that doesn't announce itself as abuse because it arrives in increments, each layer thin enough to rationalize in the moment, the full weight of it only becoming clear when you are already too far inside to leave without a cost you cannot afford. Richard Calloway had docked her wages for property damages she had not caused. Twice for items she hadn't touched. Once for a wine stain documented in an estate inventory photograph taken 6 weeks before she was hired. She had been required to work 14-hour days during weeks. The house hosted guests, and when she raised the matter of overtime compensation, Paul Vance had informed her in measured professional language that live-in household staff fell under a separate classification, and that if she wished to contest that classification, alternative employment was available to her. She had stayed. She had needed the income. That was the lever, and Richard Calloway had known precisely where it sat. The night of her dismissal, she had been working a dinner party. 8 guests at the long mahogany table. She had served the wrong wine. Not the wrong wine by any objective measure, but the wrong one by Richard's standard, a distinction that existed entirely in his interpretation of an instruction delivered verbally 2 hours before service. He picked up his water glass, looked at her across the table in front of 8 people he had known for years, and threw it at her face. The water reached her first. Then the rim of the glass caught her cheekbone on the way to the floor. Not one guest spoke. Not one held his gaze. They returned to their conversations within seconds, the practiced collective behavior of people who have agreed without discussion that what just happened falls outside the range of things that require acknowledgement. Gloria had picked up the glass. She had walked to the kitchen. She had pressed a dish towel to her face until the bleeding stopped. The next morning, Paul Vance appeared at the staff quarters with a 2-page document and a check for $12,000. She had signed without legal representation because she had never signed an NDA before, and no one explained that she was permitted to keep a copy. She had never worked in domestic service again. "Do you still have a copy of the NDA?" "No. They took both pages. I didn't know I could keep one." Celeste paused then. "The night of the dinner, did anyone else witness what happened?" Gloria looked at her steadily. "His son was there, Owen. He was seated 3 chairs down on the right side of the table. He saw the whole thing." Celeste drove back to Greenwich with Gloria's testimony recorded on a secondary device inside her jacket lining. Marcus confirmed receipt at 11:42 p.m. and had the file archived and time-stamped by midnight. Month 8. Richard hired a private security consultant. The man spent 3 days at the estate conducting what were described to staff as routine security assessments. The questions he asked were pointed and specific and aimed almost entirely at one person. Had Celeste been observed using a personal device during working hours? Had anyone seen her enter rooms outside her assigned rotation? Had she expressed any unusual opinions about her employer or the household? Marta came to Celeste's door that evening, voice barely above breath. "He's building something specifically against you. I don't know what it is, but I can see the shape of it." Celeste thanked her and closed the door. She sat on the edge of her bed and thought about the 8 months of footage on Marcus's server. 11 names. Gloria's testimony. Devon's note. The handwritten memo. The financial trail. The withdrawn labor complaints and the mechanism behind every withdrawal. She had more than enough to end Richard Calloway's public life. More than enough to dismantle the system Paul Vance had maintained for 9 years. More than enough for the civil case, the labor case, and the Senate campaign that would now never happen. But she was still missing one thing. One moment on camera so unambiguous that no attorney, no PR firm, and no amount of money could provide a competing interpretation. She didn't need to create it. She didn't need to engineer it, or provoke it, or wait for a specific circumstance. Richard Calloway had been building toward it for 8 months. He was going to hand it to her himself. The night before everything changed, Celeste sat on her staff room bed at 11 p.m. and transmitted the last of the files. Everything was now on the server. The folder photographs, all 11 termination records, all 11 ND as the handwritten memo. Gloria Sims's 2-hour testimony time-stamped and clean. Devon's note photographed and logged. The complete financial trace showing the shell company payment routes. The 4 withdrawn labor complaints and the documented mechanism behind each withdrawal. 8 months of camera footage organized by date, tagged by incident type, cleared by the ACLU attorney Marcus had brought in 3 weeks prior. She typed the final transmission note. Package is complete. Reviewing attorney has confirmed evidentiary strength on 7 distinct counts. We are ready. Marcus responded immediately. Celeste, we have enough to publish tonight. I can have the piece structured and legal reviewed by 6 a.m. We don't have to wait. She read that message twice. Not yet. Why? She thought about how to answer him honestly, about the Christopher Belmont hospital case and the 4 years it had taken to fully resolve after publication, the appeals, the procedural delays, the legal architecture. A wealthy man's attorneys could construct around documents and testimony when there was no visual record of the behavior itself. About what a man worth $340 million, with a Senate campaign in motion and 9 years of practiced impunity behind him, could do with time and resources if the evidence was strong but not unassailable, because documents can be argued. Testimony can be challenged. I need one moment on camera that cannot be contextualized away. One moment where it is simply what it is and no attorney in the country changes what it looks like. A long pause. And if he hurts you before that moment comes, he won't, not tonight. She was right about tonight. The newspaper item appeared in the Connecticut regional section of a mid-sized publication page 6 below the fold. 3 paragraphs. No name. A reference to allegations of workplace misconduct leveled against a prominent state philanthropist, described by former employees as having created a sustained hostile and exploitative work environment. A spokesperson had declined comment. A follow-up was expected. Richard read it at its kitchen counter at 7:03 a.m., still in his robe, coffee cooling in his hand. By 7:11 a.m., Paul Vance had been called. By 7:25 a.m., Paul Vance had been instructed to reach every former staff member bound by an NDA and remind them in language they would find unambiguous of the financial penalty clauses in their agreements. By 7:40 a.m., Richard Calloway had decided the source of the leak was still inside his house. He called for Celeste at 8:15. My study, now. She followed him in. He closed the door. He did not offer her a seat. He stood in the center of the room in his weekday clothes. He had dressed by then, which somehow made the room feel colder, and regarded her with the flat, methodical attention of a man conducting a procedure he had conducted before. 15 minutes. Had she spoken to any journalists? Been contacted by anyone conducting research about the estate? Did she know anything about the article? Had she ever at any point during her employment removed documents or photographs from the property? She answered each question in the same quiet, cooperative voice. No, sir. After each one, his eyes moved over her face with precise, searching attention, looking for the specific location where a composed surface gives way under pressure. He found nothing. And that nothing had been unsettling him since month 3, and it unsettled him now in a way that had weight and urgency behind it. You're lying, he said. No, sir. Something shifted. Not his expression, something deeper structural in the way he was holding himself. He picked up the manila folder from the corner of his desk, her employment file, the copy his system had generated, and threw it. The pages separated in the air and scattered across the floor in a wide arc. Her fake resume landed at the top of the pile. Pick those up. She bent to gather them. No. His voice dropped to something quieter and more deliberate. Hands and knees, like where you belong. She got on her hands and knees on the study floor and gathered the pages one by one while Richard Calloway stood over her. The glasses camera captured his face from below. Jaw-set shoulders squared, wearing the expression of a man who had done this to people many times and had never been required to account for it. That's the natural order, he said. I have built more before breakfast than your entire family will see in a lifetime. And you are on your knees on my floor picking up my papers. Look at what you are. Look at where you are. That's not an accident. That's exactly where you belong." She gathered the last page. She stood up. She looked at him directly. "Thank you," she said, quietly and without emphasis. "That's exactly what I needed." The sentence landed in the room the way something lands when it has been dropped from a significant height. His face moved through 3 distinct expressions in under 2 seconds: confusion, then a dawning understanding, then something past understanding that had no name, and then his hand wrapped around her arm, and he was moving, pulling her out of the study down the hallway, through the foyer toward the front entrance, and his voice had lost every trace of its professional control. He threw her toward the door. She caught herself on the door frame. She straightened slowly. She turned around. 2 words. Quiet as a verdict read in a room where the verdict has already been known for a long time. Jasmine Webb. His hands dropped to his sides, as though the bones had been removed from them. His face went from red to white in the span of a single heartbeat. For the first time in 8 months, Richard Calloway looked at Celeste Morgan and saw something he had never once considered looking for. He stood very still. That was what the 6 people watching from the foyer's various doorways would remember most clearly when asked later to describe what happened. Not the dragging, not the screaming, not the sound of Celeste catching herself on the door frame. What they remembered was the quality of stillness that followed 2 words. The way a man who had controlled every room he had ever stood in suddenly looked like something that had run out of whatever was holding it upright. "What did you say to me?" Jasmine Webb. The same tone, the same steadiness. 19 years old, 7 months in this house. Fired on a Tuesday and accused of stealing a pearl necklace that you subsequently reported to your insurance provider as misplaced, a discrepancy documented in your own records. $8,000 and a non-disclosure agreement signed 3 days later, flagged personally in writing, on your letterhead to every domestic staffing agency in Connecticut within 60 days. Deceased 6 months after that. Her mother's name is Naomi. She lives on Prescott Avenue in Bridgeport. She has never deleted Jasmine's last voicemail. Richard's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Gloria Sims. You threw a water glass at her face in front of 8 dinner guests, and not one of them spoke. She signed her NDA without legal counsel because no one told her she was allowed to keep a copy. She has not worked in this field since. Devin Briggs. Marta Reyes. 11 years of service. $22,000 per year. While your foundation donated $2 million to a university her daughter cannot afford to attend. Celeste reached up and removed the reading glasses. She set them on the foyer table lens facing upward, both cameras still transmitting. 9 others across 5 years. All people of color. All processed through the same system. All paid to disappear. She paused. The foyer was absolutely silent. 6 people who had spent months learning not to breathe too loudly stood in their doorways and did not move. My name is Celeste Morgan. I am an investigative journalist. I have been employed in this house for 8 months. Every room, every conversation, every incident has been documented on camera. The complete evidentiary package footage, financial records, NDA documentation, written correspondence, and witness testimony was transmitted to a secured legal server last night. It has been reviewed by attorneys at the ACLU and a labor law specialist at Yale Law School. Senator Patricia Haynes received a full copy of the documentation 45 minutes ago. Outside through the foyer's tall windows, a black car turned through the front gate. Then a second car. Then a white van with a satellite dish mounted on its roof. Then another. The driveway, which had seen nothing but catered deliveries and town cars for 20 years, was filling. Marta appeared in the kitchen doorway with one hand pressed flat against the frame. Devin Briggs, who had received a call on his personal phone that morning, who had driven from Bridgeport before sunrise and parked quietly on the service road, stepped into view from the garden entrance. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at Richard Calloway in a way that 2 years of employment in that house had never once permitted him to look at anyone. At the top of the staircase, Owen Calloway gripped the banister with both hands and looked down at his father from the landing. He had heard everything from the moment the first name was spoken. He had not moved. He was not going to close this door. "You have nothing," Richard said. The sentence had the structural integrity of a wall whose foundation had already been removed, still standing. Briefly. "I have everything," Celeste said, "and so does Jasmine's mother." Senator Patricia Haynes did not come inside. She stood on the front steps and delivered a prepared statement to the assembled cameras, labor violations sustained across 7 years illegal non-disclosure coercion, a documented pattern of racial abuse and wage theft affecting 11 identified workers of color. Her office was referring the matter to both the State Attorney General and the Federal Department of Labor, simultaneously effective that morning. Emergency NDA reform legislation would be introduced in the current session. Paul Vance was arrested at his Stamford office at 2:17 p.m. He did not resist. Richard Calloway was served with a civil complaint at the estate's front door at 4 p.m. Class Action 11, named Plaintiffs. Naomi Webb's name was first on the list. The documentary aired 6 weeks later. 14 million views in 48 hours. A bidding process that lasted less than 2 days. Comments and conversations that moved from screens into legislative chambers and into the kind of public record that cannot be managed, reframed or purchased back into silence. Owen Calloway gave a voluntary deposition to the civil litigation team. When the attorney asked why he had finally decided to speak, he looked at his hands for a moment before answering. "Because a woman in a gray uniform said the name of a 19-year-old girl on my father's foyer floor. And I finally understood what it costs a person to know something and spend years choosing not to act on it." Marta Reyes received a court-ordered back wages settlement of $54,000, the gap between what she had been paid and what Connecticut labor law required, calculated across 11 years of service. She used a portion of it to fly to Virginia for the first time and watch her daughter receive a diploma on a stage. At a journalism awards ceremony held in New York 3 months later, Celeste stood at a podium in a dark blazer and spoke without notes. "This story does not belong to me. It belongs to Jasmine Webb, who walked through a service entrance every morning for 7 months believing she would be treated as a person. She was right to believe that. She was a person. The house was wrong. The silence that protected it was wrong. And the people who work in houses like it, who arrive before sunrise and leave after dark, and are called by room names instead of their own, they are right to expect better. They always were." Naomi Webb watched the ceremony from her kitchen table in Bridgeport. When Celeste said her daughter's name, Naomi leaned forward and pressed 2 fingers to the laptop screen. She held them there for a long time. In Celeste's home office, taped above her desk, was a photograph of a young woman with bright eyes and a wide smile, 19 years old, laughing at whoever held the camera. Below it, in Celeste's handwriting, she was right to expect better. So are all of them. Some people are dragged across marble floors and called nothing. They survive it not because they are weak, but because they are building something the person dragging them cannot see. Dignity is not given by the house you work in. It is carried in quietly every single morning by the person who shows up anyway. Jasmine Webb deserved better. So does every invisible person in every room that has never once learned their name. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and what you think it means to finally say a name out loud. And if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, subscribe. There are more rooms, more names, and someone needs to be listening.